A South African court has just made a ruling that could shake Southern Africa and the political world to its core. The remains of former Zambian President Edgar Lungu are now set to be returned to Zambia. But this is no ordinary handover. Inside Zambia, the decision has triggered protests, fierce reactions, and direct confrontation with President Hakainde Hichilema. International observers are now warning this could escalate into a full-blown political crisis. From Lusaka to London, from Johannesburg to Washington, the world is watching. This is the story behind the headline, and why it matters to all of us. South African court's decision to return the remains of former Zambian President Edgar Lungu to Zambia has sparked intense political drama and is making headlines around the globe. In this video, we break down the legal details behind the SA court's decision, why the ruling has ignited protests and political tension in Zambia, how President Hakainde Hichilema is responding, what this means for regional politics and international relations. This is more than a national dispute, it's a political story with global stakes. The SA court ruling explained. The South African judiciary is renowned for its independence and robustness, often playing a pivotal role in shaping regional and international political dynamics. For the purpose of this response, let's assume the SA court ruling refers to a hypothetical constitutional court of South Africa, ConCourt, decision that has significant implications for Zambia, potentially involving a bilateral issue such as trade, extradition, or a human rights case with cross-border ramifications. To explore this, I'll outline the structure of South Africa's judicial system, the nature of the ruling, and its legal and political significance. South Africa's judicial system. South Africa's constitutional court, established under the 1996 Constitution, is the apex court for constitutional matters, with the power to review legislation, executive actions, and lower court decisions for compliance with the Bill of Rights and constitutional principles. The court's rulings often have far-reaching implications, not only domestically but also regionally, given South Africa's economic and political influence in the Southern African Development Community, SADC. A hypothetical ruling could involve extradition or legal cooperation, a case where South Africa rules on the extradition of a prominent Zambian figure accused of corruption or political crimes, sparking controversy in Zambia. Trade or economic dispute, a ruling on a trade agreement or economic policy affecting Zambian exports, e.g., copper or agricultural goods, to South Africa, which is a major trading partner. Human rights or refugee issue, a decision on asylum seekers or refugees from Zambia, impacting bilateral relations and regional stability. Environmental or resource dispute, a ruling on cross-border resource management, such as water rights in the Zambezi River Basin, which both countries share. Hypothetical scenario. Let's assume the ConCourt ruled on a case involving a Zambian opposition leader accused of financial misconduct who sought refuge in South Africa. The court's decision to deny asylum and approve extradition to Zambia, citing legal obligations under SADC protocols, could trigger significant political and social repercussions. The ruling might be based on evidence of corruption but perceived in Zambia as politically motivated, especially if the leader is a critic of President Hakainde Hichilema's HH administration. Legal implications. The ruling would hinge on South Africa's obligations under international law, including treaties like the SADC Protocol on Extradition, 2002, and the UN Convention Against Corruption. The ConCourt would likely emphasize judicial independence, the court's commitment to impartiality, despite political pressures from either country. Human rights considerations, balancing the right to asylum with the need to combat corruption. Bilateral relations, upholding cooperative agreements with Zambia while respecting South Africa's sovereignty. The decision could set a precedent for how South Africa handles politically sensitive extradition cases, influencing its role as a regional leader. It might also spark debates about the politicization of judicial processes, with critics arguing that South Africa is aligning with Zambia's ruling party to suppress dissent. Regional context. South Africa and Zambia share a complex history, with Zambia supporting South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle by hosting ANC exiles in the 1970s and 1980s. A ruling perceived as favoring Zambia's government could strain this historical goodwill, especially if Zambian opposition groups view it as interference in their domestic politics. Conversely, upholding the rule of law could strengthen South Africa's reputation as a regional arbiter of justice. Political reaction in Zambia. Zambia's political landscape is polarized, with President Hakainde Hichilema's United Party for National Development, UPND, facing opposition from groups like the Patriotic Front, PF, and emerging parties. A South African court ruling impacting a Zambian figure or policy would likely elicit varied reactions across the political spectrum. Government response. The UPND government, led by President HH, might welcome a ruling that aligns with its anti-corruption agenda. Since taking office in 2021, Hichilema has prioritized economic reforms and combating corruption, reducing inflation from 24% to 9% and strengthening the Zambian kwacha. If the ruling involves extraditing a corrupt official, the government could frame it as a victory for accountability, bolstering its domestic and international credibility. However, the government would need to navigate accusations of politicizing the judiciary. Opposition parties might claim that Hichilema influenced South Africa's decision through diplomatic channels, undermining Zambia's sovereignty. The government would likely counter by emphasizing respect for international law and judicial cooperation. Opposition reaction. Opposition groups, particularly the PF, could view the ruling as an attack on their leadership or a broader attempt to suppress dissent. If the extradited figure is a prominent opposition leader, the PF might rally supporters, framing the ruling as foreign interference orchestrated by the UPND. This could escalate political tensions, especially in urban centers like Lusaka and the Copperbelt, where opposition support is strong. Civil society and media. Zambian civil society, including organizations like Amnesty International, which praised Zambia's abolition of the death penalty in 2022, might scrutinize the ruling for human rights implications. If the extradition raises concerns about fair trials or political persecution, NGOs could pressure the government to intervene. The media, often divided along partisan lines, would amplify these debates, with pro-government outlets supporting the ruling and opposition-leaning ones decrying it. Regional dynamics. Zambia's political reaction would also be shaped by its role in SADC. As a stable democracy in a region with authoritarian tendencies, Zambia might seek to maintain cordial relations with South Africa while addressing domestic backlash. The government could engage SADC mediators to defuse tensions, especially if the ruling sparks protests. Protests and public anger. A controversial court ruling could ignite protests in Zambia, particularly if it's perceived as undermining national sovereignty or targeting opposition figures. Zambia has a history of public demonstrations, often driven by economic grievances or political disputes. Nature of protests. Protests would likely concentrate in Lusaka, Kitwe, and Ndola, where urban populations are politically active. Demonstrators, possibly mobilized by opposition parties, could demand reversal of the ruling, calls for South Africa to reconsider its decision or for Zambia to reject the extradition. Government accountability. Accusations that the UPND colluded with South Africa to silence critics. Economic justice. If the ruling affects trade or resources, protests could focus on economic impacts, given Zambia's reliance on copper exports. Public anger. Public anger would stem from perceived foreign interference. South Africa's influence as a regional powerhouse might be seen as overreach, reviving historical sensitivities about external control. Political polarization. Supporters of the opposition figure could view the ruling as part of a broader crackdown on dissent, fueling distrust in Hichilema's government. Economic context. Despite economic gains under Hichilema, many Zambians face poverty and unemployment, making them receptive to narratives of injustice. Government response to protests. The Zambian government would likely deploy police to manage demonstrations, risking accusations of heavy-handedness. Hichilema's administration, keen to maintain its reformist image, might also engage community leaders to calm tensions. However, excessive force or arrests could escalate unrest, drawing international scrutiny. Social media and X sentiment. Posts on X would reflect polarized views. Pro-government users might praise the ruling as a step toward justice, while opposition supporters could share hashtags like #ZambiaUnderAttack or #NoToExtradition, amplifying public anger. The platform's role in shaping narratives would be significant, with misinformation risks exacerbating tensions. President HH's response. President Hakainde Hichilema, a businessman turned politician, has cultivated an image as a pragmatic leader focused on economic recovery and governance reform. His response to the crisis would balance domestic pressures with international diplomacy. Domestic strategy. Hichilema would likely address the nation, deliver a televised speech emphasizing respect for the rule of law and Zambia's commitment to fighting corruption, framing the ruling as a cooperative effort with South Africa. Engage stakeholders. meet with opposition leaders, civil society, and traditional authorities to prevent escalation, though opposition distrust could limit effectiveness. Manage protests. Direct security forces to maintain order while urging restraint to avoid international criticism. Diplomatic approach. Hichilema would engage South Africa bilaterally to clarify the ruling's implications and ensure smooth implementation. He might also involve SADC to mediate, reinforcing Zambia's commitment to regional unity. If the ruling involves human rights concerns, Hichilema could request assurances of fair treatment for the extradited individual. Political risks. Hichilema's response carries risks. Alienating supporters. If he appears too conciliatory towards South Africa, he could lose nationalist support. Opposition backlash. Failure to address opposition concerns could deepen polarization. Economic fallout. If the ruling disrupts trade or investment, Hichilema's economic achievements could be undermined. X sentiment. Hichilema's response would be closely watched on X, with users like Ada Campbell praising his economic successes but others criticizing perceived foreign influence. His ability to control the narrative would depend on effective communication and transparency. International reactions. US, UK, AU. The international community, particularly the US, UK, and African Union, AU, would respond based on their strategic interests and the crisis's implications. United States. The US, focused on promoting democracy and combating corruption in Africa, might support the ruling if it aligns with anti-corruption efforts. However, concerns about human rights or political persecution could prompt cautious statements urging fair trials. The U.S. Embassy in Lusaka might issue a statement like, "We support judicial cooperation but call for transparency and respect for human rights." If protests escalate, the U.S. could offer technical assistance for crowd control or mediation. United Kingdom. The UK, with historical ties to Zambia and a focus on Commonwealth governance, would likely emphasize dialogue and stability. The Foreign Office might issue a statement supporting the rule of law while urging all parties to avoid violence. If the crisis affects Zambian exports, e.g. copper, the UK could engage economically to stabilize markets, given its interest in African resources. African Union. The AU, committed to African solutions for African problems, would likely advocate for SADC-led mediation. Drawing on its response to other crises, like the DRC-Rwanda conflict, the AU might call for a summit to address tensions, emphasizing sovereignty and regional cooperation. If human rights are at stake, the AU's Peace and Security Council could deploy observers to monitor protests. Broader implications. International reactions would reflect geopolitical interests. The US and UK would balance support for South Africa's judiciary with concerns about Zambian stability. Regional stability. The AU would prioritize preventing escalation in SADC, given South Africa and Zambia's economic importance. Human rights. All actors would face pressure from NGOs to ensure fair treatment of affected individuals. What happens next? The crisis's trajectory depends on several factors. Zambian government actions. If Hichilema manages protests effectively and communicates transparently, tensions could subside. Failure to do so might lead to prolonged unrest or opposition gains. South African response. South Africa's willingness to clarify the ruling and engage diplomatically could mitigate backlash. International mediation, SADC or AU intervention could de-escalate tensions, while US/UK support might influence economic outcomes. Public sentiment. If protests grow, they could force policy changes or strain Zambia-South Africa relations. Possible scenarios include resolution, diplomatic efforts and public engagement calm tensions, with the extradition proceeding smoothly. Escalation, protests intensify, leading to violence or economic disruptions, prompting international sanctions or aid. Stalemate, ongoing tensions without resolution, weakening Hichilema's government and regional cooperation. Closing analysis. This hypothetical crisis highlights the delicate balance of judicial independence, national sovereignty, and regional cooperation in Southern Africa. South Africa's court ruling, while legally sound, could expose fault lines in Zambia's polarized politics, testing Hichilema's leadership and the resilience of SADC ties. International actors, particularly the US, UK, and AU, would play critical roles in shaping outcomes, balancing support for legal processes with concerns about stability and human rights. The crisis underscores broader themes. Judicial influence. South Africa's judiciary can shape regional politics, but its rulings risk being politicized. Zambian politics. Hichilema's reforms face challenges from opposition narratives and public discontent. Regional dynamics. SADC's ability to mediate cross-border disputes is crucial for stability. Global interests. The US, UK, and AU's responses reflect competing priorities of governance, economic interests, and human rights. In conclusion, resolving such a crisis requires transparent communication, regional cooperation, and respect for sovereignty. The long-term impact would depend on how all parties navigate the immediate fallout and address underlying tensions.